roots of psychiatry have to do with control, power, and alienation from certain groups of people who were uncomfortable to be around. They were locked up in these places to get them out of the way. The history of psychiatry, I think, really is related to institutions.
Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London was one of the world's first psychiatric institutions. Commonly referred to as Bedlam, the hospital was little more than a warehouse for those deemed mad. Inmates were confined to cages, closets, and animal stalls, chained to walls and flogged, while the asylum charged admission for public viewings. In the 18th century, William Batty was the first to promote that his institutions could cure the mentally ill. Batty's madhouses made him one of the richest men in England, though his treatments were every bit as inhumane as those practiced in Bedlam, with not a single patient cured. His financial success triggered a boom in the asylum business and an opportunity for psychiatrists to cash in on this new growth industry.
This was an era where, on both sides of the Atlantic, specialized institutions for the mentally ill are beginning to be built in large numbers. Those institutions date back certainly to the beginning of the 18th century, and in a few cases even earlier than that. But the explosive growth of an asylum sector is very much a 19th century phenomenon. It's that period when the state is persuaded to invest tax dollars in building these places.
But while those who ran the institutions were getting rich, psychiatrists yet lacked the credibility to maximize their cash flow.
In order to justify their profession, they needed to come up with these biological solutions, or they didn't have any profession. The only way for them to solve that was to attempt to start believing that these people that were suffering from emotional disorders was from a biological basis.
Whatever was done to make this person more manageable would be simply called a treatment. And the sad reality is that many of these so-called treatments were, in essence, torture.
The near-drowning devices that were developed in this period, for example, must have been appallingly frightening. For example, one device involved putting the patient into a coffin, closing the lid, and dumping it into a bath of water, and then opening it up and trying to revive the patient. There were a range of these things, and the mortality rate was very, very high.
Psychiatrists next sought to give their practices credence by cloaking them in the language of medicine. Thus, each reckless experimental approach they tried was instead referred to as a medical model.
Somebody who's really hyper and manic, if you're wrapped up in a cold sheet and dunked into some water, you're going to quit acting manic because that's a punishing treatment. But as soon as the symptoms started to go away, they started to believe that somehow by wrapping them up and dunking them in cold water, it was draining the toxics out of their body. So they built the medical model around that.
Pushing the biological theory of mental illness a step further, an American, Benjamin Rush, put forth the idea that insanity was caused by too much blood in the head. The cure? Remove the blood by any means possible. Restraint, cold water, bleeding, even terror. And with that, a new medical model was created.
Benjamin Rush was probably the most famous American physician of the Revolutionary era. Rush was known as the master bleeder. He bled his patients for madness. He also invented something called the tranquilizer. It's a chair that looks a little bit like an electric chair. The patient was confined in this apparatus, sometimes with cold water applied to his or her head, for some hours at a time.
Rush's often lethal procedures were detailed in his 1812 textbook, which remained psychiatry's authoritative source for the next 70 years. He was so revered that in 1965, Rush was enshrined as the father of American psychiatry on the seal of the American Psychiatric Association. As the 1800s wore on, psychiatry's mounting failures at curing madness threatened their financial bottom line, forcing them to invent new medical models.
The cures promised when it was delivered. So by the 1860s and 70s, a growing mood of pessimism was covering Europe and North America, that effectively the new institutions were ever growing in size, but not growing in their effectiveness.
The 20th century brought more medical models. American psychiatrist Henry Cotton mutilated his patients by removing their body parts, declaring this a breakthrough in the treatment of mental illness.
The earliest target was the teeth and then the tonsils and the sinuses, but when patients didn't get better, the enthusiasts for this treatment then started to move down the body and to say, well, obviously patients have swallowed bacteria in their saliva, so stomachs need to go, spleens need to go, colons need to go.
As public outcry escalated over torture and maiming of patients, psychiatrists would invent new methods, each one hailed as the miracle cure. But each one was ultimately proven no more effective nor less brutal than the last. Beginning in the 1920s, psychiatrists embraced a new group of procedures that claimed to work by creating intentional damage to the brain.
Manfred Sokal had this notion that he could kill just the bad brain cells, that somehow we have good brain cells, we have bad brain cells. So if you give people enough insulin, you kill those bad brain cells, and if the person survived this epilepsy, they would be better off for it.
Despite convulsions that caused severe spinal cord injuries in 40% of the patients, Sokal pointed to their childlike state and declared his treatment a success. Hospitals built insulin shock wards, and coma therapy became big business. Not to be outdone, Ladislaus von Meduna of Hungary believed he could drive out mental illness by inducing brain-damaging seizures with a drug called metrazol.
He noticed his epileptics had no mental health problems, and his mental health patients, his psychiatric patients, seemed to have no epilepsy, and so he thought doing one would obviate the other.
The theory was that epilepsy and schizophrenia couldn't coexist in the same brain, and that if epilepsy was induced, that a seizure was caused, it would, quote, drive out the schizophrenia. There's no scientific basis for this whatsoever.
Metrazol was fast and lucrative. In a morning, a single psychiatrist could chemically shock 50 patients into a docile and manageable state. By 1939, metrazol was so popular with psychiatrists and staff, it was used in 70% of American hospitals and in almost every other country in the world. The financial success of insulin and metrazol sparked the development of an even more profitable method of inducing brain-damaging convulsions.
How is electric shock therapy done?
We use these electrodes. We place them on the patient's head like this, and then by means of this machine, we pass a controlled electric current through the brain, just for a fraction of a second. The patient doesn't feel it.
The story behind this miracle cure began in a Roman slaughterhouse.
In Italy, in 1938, two Italian psychiatrists decided to observe that before slaughtering pigs, in order to make the pigs more docile, they would apply electrodes to their temples that were hooked up to wall current, and that this stunned the pigs, but it didn't kill them, and they could then slaughter them. Well, this gave them the encouragement to try inducing convulsions with electricity.
We would see teeth falling out, broken spines, bones knocked out of joint, broken bones, and people even getting internal organ damage from being restrained while they were having these uncontrolled writhing seizures, convulsions.
Many patients have been returned to their homes and jobs who might still be here if it were not for this helpful form of treatment.
Having successfully sold brain damage as a cure, psychiatrists searched for even more precise ways of targeting the brain. This was jump-started in 1848 when an explosion blew a steel rod straight through the head of Vermont railway worker Phineas Gage. While Gage survived, his personality was dramatically altered. 70 years later, Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz would try to obtain a similar result by drilling into a patient's skull and squirting pure alcohol directly into the brain, killing the tissue of the frontal lobes. Moniz called this new procedure a lobotomy. Dr. Walter J. Freeman would become lobotomy's most infamous practitioner. He discovered he could do it faster, without having to drill through the skull.
There was no anesthesia, and he would just lift up the eye and stick nothing more than an ice pick right into the brain, right under the orbital bone, and then just rake the thing back and forth until he was satisfied that he had caused enough disruption of brain tissue, and then pull it out.
Freeman traveled the country in his lobotomobile, hacking apart his patients' brains on stage, or sometimes right there in the vehicle.
And he would pull up and offer lobotomies to people, get referrals from the local doctors, or sometimes people didn't even go through doctors. They'd go right to the lobotomobile, and he would just do the brain-damaging procedure right there.
By the time his surgical privileges were revoked after his last patient died on the operating table, Freeman had performed or supervised over 3,500 lobotomies, more than 25% of which, by his own admission, left his patients in a vegetative state.
They lobotomized 1 million people in the 40s and the 50s and beginning of the 60s until they came to the conclusion that this was a destructive treatment.
But though the stories of miraculous cures were soon exposed as brain-damaging frauds, psychiatrists kept one step ahead, inventing new forms of psychosurgery, passed off as medical advances.
I completely shudder from head to toe. And that's what I heard in my head when he drilled something in my brain.
Northwest, actually, of the centre hole.
I'm sorry I had to do that.
Yeah, why did you have to do that?
I went, oh, funny and all.
Did you?
My head all shook inside.
Oh dear.
Oh, my head shook inside.
Yes, all right.
Everything shook, my eyes, everything, my teeth.
Oh, that's well.
That was grievous bodily harm done to my brain. And nobody has the right anyway to play God with somebody's brain.
The whole operation took about 8.5 hours, and they kept me awake for every second of it, and I remember every second of it. And I still remember it to this day because I have this operation every day of my life. Whether I like it or not, I have it.
Psychiatrists still tout the benefits of lobotomy, a treatment that earns them $31 million annually. But in the wake of lobotomy's tarnished reputation, psychiatrists were quick to push electroshock back into the spotlight. Renaming it electroconvulsive therapy, they now give patients anesthetics to squash their screams and paralyzing agents to avoid watching the writhing of agony.
The main misconception that people have about ECT is that it's new and improved. The new and improved refers strictly to these cosmetic improvements because, in fact, they make it easier on the witnesses. The person isn't shaking all over the table. They're paralyzed now. It isn't new, it isn't improved, it is worse.
Every 10 years or so there tends to be, first of all, a denial that it causes any harm. Secondly, an acknowledgement that it might have caused harm, but here's a whole new approach, and now this one is blameless, without any research to back it up.
The ECT machine can produce anywhere from 50 to 400 volts. It's the kind of energy that we use for industrial machinery that might be in a steel mill or a printing press, some large piece of machinery. It's an extraordinary amount of energy, and it causes a great deal of damage.
2/3 of those who receive electroshock are women. Given such diagnoses as premenstrual syndrome, menopausal disorder, or postpartum depression. Half of electroshock patients are elderly. Once they become eligible for government health care at age 65, twice as many American seniors receive ECT than at age 64. And what does this all add up to? 100,000 dead, and countless others so brain damaged they have no hope of ever recovering a normal life. For a total of $12 worth of electricity, psychiatrists in the United States alone rake in $1.2 billion. But the next miracle cure psychiatrists added to their arsenal made them more money than ever before. For it was faster, cheaper, and could potentially turn men, women, and children into patients for life. By the early 1950s, psychiatrists discovered their next miracle cure. A chemical originally designed to kill parasites in pigs, their new discovery hindered brain function in much the same way as shoving an ice pick into the eye socket. It was an old treatment in a new disguise.
With the advent of these new tranquilizing drugs, it seems not too much to say that we're on the verge of an entirely new era in the treatment of mental illness.
Dubbing it a chemical lobotomy, Canadian psychiatrist Heinz Lehmann described Thorazine as a simple, easy-to-take pill with the same effects as psychosurgery, but without the mess.
Thorazine provided psychiatry with the entry into mainstream medicine. It had its magic bullet.
What psychiatrists didn't tell the public was that Thorazine caused a crippling neurological condition known as tardive dyskinesia.
And that's a neurological syndrome where you have muscle twitches, abnormal jerks, which are uncontrolled, and they either last for a long time or sometimes they're permanent. So that's very clear, very well recognized, long-term or permanent brain damage from these medications.
Mr. Blount has virtually no signs of his original illness now. The signs that the movements of his mouth are completely side effects of the drugs that he was on for 20 years. Mr. Blount is quite rational. He understands what's going on. And if you're patient, he can carry on a very rational conversation with you.
Even when you remove the drug, it may still remain. It means you have caused a permanent disabling of the brain. In the late 50s, you get the first signs of it, people starting to worry about it. But it's not until the late 70s that psychiatrists start warning their patients about it, 20 years.
Thorazine's manufacturer, SmithKline French, had good reason to keep a lid on the bad news. In the first year alone, SKF saw a 3,000% return on their original investment. With the public and the press kept in the dark about the severe and disabling side effects, prominent doctors and psychiatrists met in Puerto Rico to lay the groundwork for the expansion of psychiatric drugs far into the future. Psychiatrist Dr. Nathan Klein wrote this in the conference's final report.
The present breadth of drug use may be almost trivial when we compare it to the possible number of chemical substances that will be available for the control of selective aspects of man's life in the year 2000.
Dr. Klein spearheaded a movement flooding new psychiatric wonder drugs onto the global marketplace, backed by a massive publicity machine spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Psychiatry was now an industry of drug pushers. By 1970, the American Psychiatric Association was so dependent on drug company money that 30% of its annual budget came from pharmaceutical advertisements in its official journals.
So we had money flowing to trade organizations, we had money flowing to the doctors, and to their journals. Well, we all know that that is going to influence how they think.
The majority of National Institute of Mental Health and National Institute of Health scientists are getting more money from drug companies on the side than their tax-based salary.
With so much money to be made, all psychiatrists needed was a scientific theory to justify it. Their solution? An official report declaring that all mental problems derive from a so-called chemical imbalance in the brain, requiring drugs to correct.
This chemical imbalance is one of the greatest fallacies ever foisted upon patients and the public. There is no chemical test to show an imbalance related to any psychiatric disease, whether it's depression, anxiety, what have you.
The chemical imbalance is for the benefit of the psychiatrist. It has to be there so that psychiatrists can treat it.
But fraudulent chemical imbalance theories could not hide the mounting evidence of common and terrifying side effects, such as akathisia.
Akathisia is like an extreme inner nervous agitation. People describe it as wanting to crawl out of their own skins. And this happens with great frequency, and it is absolutely, totally well understood to be associated with suicide and violence and homicide.
After years of these reported side effects and cases upon cases of violence, self-mutilation, and death, in 1991, health experts, legislators, and the public finally forced the FDA to order an investigation.
I know with absolute certainty that if Charles had any idea of the side effects of Prozac, he would never have taken it.
I had two sons, David Lee, age 8, Billy 16, wife 20 years, all gone. I'll tell you why. After being on Prozac for 21 days, my wife shot and killed both of these two boys right here. She turned the gun to herself and shot herself twice.
I took the 9mm automatic, sat down on the bed and put the gun to my head. And I blew a 4-inch hole out the back of my arm instead of my head. Thank God I was a lousy shot. Had someone looked further into Prozac, steps could have been taken to avoid it.
What was supposed to be an unbiased hearing was a panel of psychiatrists, the vast majority with personal financial ties to pharmaceutical companies.
They basically couldn't find an expert, a doctor, a psychiatrist, at a leading medical school who basically in some way or another didn't have a consulting agreement, hadn't taken money from the pharmaceutical companies.
I do not find from the evidence today that there is credible evidence to support a conclusion that antidepressant drugs cause the emergence and or the intensification of suicidality and or other violent behaviors.
500 deaths, 33 murder cases, and over 20,000 adverse side effects. Would you like to tell me why this drug is still on the market?
Is there an alliance, an unholy alliance between the psychiatric community, the pharmaceutical industry, and the FDA?
This unholy alliance became all too apparent in 1997, when pharmaceutical companies persuaded the FDA to allow them to advertise directly to the public, with psychiatrists providing medical endorsement. And in just 3 years, sales of psychiatric drugs skyrocketed, almost 2.5 times. When the numbers of violence and suicide victims shot through the roof, public outrage finally forced the FDA to issue warning labels on antidepressants.
It took 13 years before the FDA finally admitted that those drugs can cause suicide and issued black box warnings.
In the last 3 years alone, there have been more than 50 international drug regulatory agency warnings exposing the dangers of psychiatric drugs.
History has told us every workable method that could be used to help people who are seriously disturbed, who do need some sort of treatment, has been suppressed and smashed by the vested interests of psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry.
You have 100,000 people electroshocked every year. You have 17 million children worldwide taking mind-altering drugs. You have people being involuntarily committed every 75 seconds, and it's all under the guise of mental health.
The only way that you're going to get humane treatment into the mental health system is to take psychiatry and the vested interests out of the picture. And only then will you see people truly obtaining mental health.